So we're going to do the same sort of activity we did for the back end, but this time for the front end. And that means we're going to create a repository for the front end, and we're going to create a pipeline and actually a code build also to basically take our source code, front end source code, and push it all the way through until it gets into S3. So I've already done some pre-work here, stuff that we've already done before, and I'll just walk you through what I did. First thing I did was I created a new code commit repo, right, called front end. And then I copied the files from my downloads folder, from my GitHub account, put them in here, right? And then I added one file that's new, and that's the build spec, because we're going to have a build in this process. And I'll just show it to you real quick. Again, this is in the repo. That's linked into the story. The build spec here, if you look at it carefully, it basically, let me blow it up here, zoom in. Basically what's happening here is, once it downloads the repo, it does an npm install, then it does an npm build, which creates a build folder, and then it generates a zip file, which is the artifact, which is basically all the files that are in the build folder kind of get zipped together. Okay, so that's essentially, we haven't built the pipeline or the build yet, but that's the file that we'll be using to drive the build step. Okay, so now that we have the repo in place, we can actually go and build the pipeline. Pipelines. Okay, let me pause for 1 second. Okay, I'm back. Okay, so let's go ahead. We got the repo. Let's go build a pipeline with it. We're going to call this pipeline front end. We're going to let it generate a new service role. Hit next. Source provider is code commit. The repo is front end. Branch, master branch, right? So it's to detect changes there. We need a new build. We're going to create a project. We're going to call this front end. We don't need Docker. Create a new service role. We already have a build spec in the file. Leave all the logs the same. Oh, I forgot some steps here. We want to use Ubuntu, standard, the latest version of the image. Okay, now I think we're done. Okay, that should automatically fill in here. There it is. There's our front end, right? We do have an environment variable. Forget about this. When we were doing our builds locally, we did have an environment variable that we used. So I have to look that up real quick. That would be to-dos or us front end. So there's an environment file we have here. So I'm just going to copy this whole line. So let's see the name, paste, break this into pieces here. Cut that out. Okay, so the name is React App API, and the value is going to be HTTPS API todosorus.com, and that's it. Okay, so that basically tells the front end where the back end essentially is. That's something we had built in our code. Okay, I believe we're done with that. A deployment provider, we're going to deploy straight to S3. So nice thing, there's an S3 has a deployment provider that lets you just dump stuff right into S3, which is nice. The bucket, we want to do to-dos or us. We want to extract the file before we deploy. So it comes down as a zip, and it's going to be basically, we just want to dump the files right in there. So it gets right into the root of the project. And there was one other setting in here I noticed, is you can actually go in and set your cache control headers here. And we're going to have to do this in 2 steps, but I'm going to cover all the, so if I remember right, no store was what we used for everything that was at the root. So in this first pass of the build, and again, we'll come back in a minute to fix this, but everything, including the static folder, which we didn't really want this cache control on, we're going to set everything to no store. And then we'll verify that. And then we'll do a fix to address one, basically the static folder needs a different cache control header. Okay, so I believe next, and create pipeline. So when this creates a pipeline, it's going to try to run the first time. I'm going to pause the video, and then we'll see if it worked, and then if it doesn't work, I'll troubleshoot it before I get back on the video, and I'll tell you what's going on. So let me pause the video. Okay, we're back. This took a few minutes, and so basically the build, picked up the source files, did the build step, generated a zip file, sent it over to deploy. Deploy essentially unzipped it, dumped it into S3, and if we look at S3, this is the folder for to-dos or us, and you can see the dates on these. This just happened a bit ago, and then you can see if I click on a file itself, the only other thing that I really cared about here was, did it actually set the content cache control header? And it did. Now, one of the things the thing that we need to fix is, if you look at static, the intention here was that also the files here, so these files here, properties. So now you notice that these files here also have no store on them. And our intent here really is, we want everything that's in the static folder to behave differently than what's at the root. That is, we want everything underneath here to be cached essentially forever. So I struggled with this quite a bit, and I ended up with a relatively decent solution. Because our current build process, you can only set one cache control entry. So the trick here is, let's see if I can get this right. So we're going to add a second build step, which is going to handle those files separately. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to edit this. Hopefully I can get this right on the first pass. I've done it once before. I'm going to add a stage, actually in the build stage, I am going to add another step, basically, right, that happens after the build. Oops, what did I just do? I'm going to set it back. So I'm in build. I want to add I want to go into here. I'm going to call this post build, right? And the provider is going to be, I need it to be another build. So code build this. Now the trick here is we're going to start with the build artifact that was created by the build step, okay? And we need to create a new project. Now I'm going to call this front end post build. Okay. Then I have to do all this again, which, oh well. Ubuntu standard 4. Okay. Service role, that's fine. Let this do whatever it's going to do. Now we're actually going to use, we're going to we're going to insert our own build commands here and switch to editor, right? And because we don't want to use the same build file that's in the repo, this is going to be like a little mini build. And what this mini build basically is going to do, there's really no build step per se. What there are is we have some artifacts that we need to generate here. So we did not mean to do that. Let's see if I can delete. Okay. Files. So we're going to take the old build folder, and we're going to pick up all the files, */*, but we want to use a new base directory. So this will be, we want to pick up basically all the static files. So we're going to start with that zip file already starts with the build. We want to pick up all the files that are in static itself. And just basically, we don't do anything other than this build other than pick up those files and zip up those files separately, basically. So we leave this alone, and we continue back to pipeline. This should automatically populate the pipeline. There it is. So there's our front end post build, right? And we don't need any environment variables here because this is just basically, now we want to do an output artifact though. We want to name this output. So the other one, this is basically, I think the other one was called, I believe the other artifact was called build artifact. So this is going to be post build artifact. Post build artifact. Right. Okay, so if this is working right, so after the build happens, they call post build, which is going to take the build zip file, and then it's going to basically start with that as an entry point. It's going to pluck off just the static folder and generate a new build artifact that just has the static files in it. Okay. And then, if this works right, I should edit this stage. I need to add another deploy step. Call this one post deploy. This one is going to be another deploy S3. So we're going to deploy a second time to S3. This time we're going to take the post build artifact, right? And we're still going to the same bucket. We want to extract the files, but we want to deploy this time just to the static folder. So it takes basically the static files, dumps in static files, and additional configuration. We want to change this cache control right here. And of course I can't remember it now. So cache control header. I want to essentially indefinitely cache this, which is this entry right here. Copy, cache control. So now the static files are basically being overwritten the second time, but this time with another cache control header. And then we should be done. So we just basically added 2 steps. So I'm going to save this. Let me save it. This should trigger, I believe when I save it, it probably triggers a new build. If it doesn't, I'm going to push this release changes again. Actually, that may not have done anything, so I have to push release changes, which will then trigger another build step. I'm going to pause the video, and we'll see if this actually worked. Okay, we're back. Just took a few minutes. So we can see here now the front end code, front end pipeline ran. It has a build and a post build. I guess these are like steps within the stage, right? And we have a deploy and a post deploy, right? Now we can validate this actually did what I expected is by going into, one is I should still see the properties on index.html. I should still see no store, right? But on anything in the static folder, which would be, say, this first file here, if I look at the properties of it, metadata, instead of saying no store like I did before, now it has the public max age. So basically, this sort of a somewhat hacky solution to basically deploying this. We basically essentially deploy it twice, one for the whole folder and one for the subfolder. There's only one remaining issue kind of related to this, and we can fix this real quickly, is if we go back into S3, this is a subtle problem, you will notice that, let me go into, let's say, what happens is, actually you can kind of see the problem right here. Part of this build, it generates new files, right? And they don't just overwrite existing files. So what then happens is, a lot of times these files get created new with new like hashes on them. So they're essentially, some of these files are not being used. Like all these other ones down here, all these pre-caches here, these are all old, these are previous builds. So we're starting to get like, these files won't be used because they're not used by index. The index file doesn't reference them, so they're just kind of just dangling. And that same problem happens in this static folder too, though we're going to have a lot of extra JavaScript bundles lying around. Right? There may be, like we'll see that's like runtime main now, or main itself, there'll be more than one version of it with different hashes on it, right? So the way we could solve this, I struggled for this a minute. I was trying to think of the easiest way of doing this, and the easiest way is we just set up a lifecycle policy on the bucket itself. So I'm going to go here, add a lifecycle policy, delete. The policy is going to be called delete or expire. I'll call it expiring. Expiring old, expiring old, right? Or just expire old. We're going to do the whole bucket. We're not doing any storage clamp. We're actually doing expiration. And basically, we're going to do any, we're not really using versioning. So I'll just, even though if we did use versioning, I'll turn on both. Basically, just purge all the files, and then we'll just set it for a year. I mean, we probably would set this probably, well, depends on your development cycle, right? How often you're committing here, right? If you're only committing once a year, then this would be a problem. You're probably committing code probably regularly. I'm going to set it just for a year. You know, space is cheap. I just don't want to be wasteful. So hit next. Yes, I know it. And then I hit save. Now it's not going to do anything right now because none of the files are over a year old. But that way, you know, we have a way of managing those old bundles, or the old JavaScript bundles lying around. We just don't keep them forever. Like a year from now, the old ones will just get wiped out. Okay, I think that's it. So now, basically, we have a process where we can now, what was the whole point of this? We can commit, you know, we can write code against the front end repo on our machine, push it up to code commit. That'll trigger a build. That'll push it to S3, which means now our end users can now get a new version of, this is todosrs.com, right? They get this new app, and as we deploy new features, we can deploy that way rather than have to copy files around. That was the whole point. Okay, that's it for this video.